There we go. All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to the monthly Drupal for Gov webinar series. I'm going to take just a few minutes to tell you a little bit about Drupal for Gov, and then I'll turn it over to our speaker who can get into the real meat of what we're here for. So for those of you that are new, Drupal for Gov is officially now actually a nonprofit organization, and it's dedicated to connecting and serving our government employees that are committed to open source technology, and not just government employees, but those that we like to call government adjacent, right? Those that support work in government and nonprofit, as well as higher ed. So we encompass a lot of different open source projects within our community, but the majority of us have had our beginnings and do most of our work in Drupal, which is where you'll see a lot of the focus of the content that comes out of Drupal for Gov. But we do have members with experience in all different types of open source projects as well. So many of you know about Drupal for Gov through our annual event, Drupal GovCon. This year it's held July 24th through the 26th at the NIH facility in Bethesda. We are open for registration. The schedule has been set, so the individual sessions and what they've been plotted against are all available on the website. So we encourage you, if you haven't already, to register and to attend the event. It's completely free. It's 3 full days of sessions and training. We actually also have a full day of training the day prior to the start of the conference on Tuesday the 23rd. And so the registration for the event is one thing, but the specific training, you do need a secondary registration. So register for the event and then also register for specific training. Specifically, what Brian's going to be talking to us about today, if this interests you and you want to learn more, he's hosting a full day training on Tuesday the 23rd. So hopefully this is going to give you guys a good intro into a topic that you can then have an opportunity to learn more from at the actual event. So if you haven't already grabbed your ticket for Drupal GovCon, I highly encourage you to do that. We usually do end up with a wait list. In addition to, went too fast. In addition to these monthly webinars and Drupal GovCon, just to make you aware of some of the other things that Drupal for Gov likes to support, is that there's a government summit that we help hold at the DrupalCon North America every year. It's usually on the Monday of the conference week, and so that is something that we do. We try to, where possible, support the Drupal Global Training Days and try to host events that match up on the calendar with them as well. And then we have this monthly webinar series. So we do actually have one planned for July. It's a DevOps themed, but I don't have all of the specifics yet. So I would encourage you, if you don't already, to follow us on Twitter at GovDrupal. Or for the Drupal GovCon event at Drupal GovCon, we'll be posting more information there as we have it. But if you just kind of mark off the third Thursday at 3 o'clock each month, we will ideally have a webinar each month. So that's it on Drupal for Gov. I'm just going to kind of turn this over to Brian now and let him tell you all of the things he's here to tell you about. So
that was highly specific. Thank you, Jess.
You're welcome.
Hey, everybody. So we're here today to talk about web components and make the case for them, as well as kind of give an overview of what they are, who's doing things with them. This isn't getting into the weeds of that topic. We'll talk about training opportunity at the end, but if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to ask. So my name is Brian Olendijk, or I'm at BTO Pro on pretty much every platform. And for the longest time, I've been the Drupal dude. I've been in the community for about 13 years. And you might know me from work on this project or seen this snowflake floating around. So I work on a project called Elm's Learning Network. It's basically like a learning management system type of an appliance, specifically focused around content. And it allows us to build, engaging experiences for students online. So as part of that, though, I'm not really the Drupal dude anymore. I'm more of the web components dude. So I've been presenting almost exclusively at Drupal events the last like 2.5 years about nothing but web components and non-Drupal events for that matter. So I've kind of radically shifted from talking about educational systems and Drupal specific projects into just web components. So this is an interesting quote just to kick us off. Everything starts with a good quote, right? So the 2,000-year leap for the web happened last year and no one has realized it yet. And I don't expect you to know who said this, because it was me right now reading this to you, because I am the advocate into the Drupal community for web components, apparently. And so I'm telling you that there is a 2,000-year leap type of it's a reference to a book, look up, a type of innovative leap in the web, and it's called web components. And it effectively allows all of our projects to be best friends forever by leveraging each other's work without leveraging every aspect of each other's work. So welcome to the web components worldview. But what are web components? And you are right to ask, because everyone has been. So web components, we're going to get a little bit into the weeds of the spec. Please don't get lost here. The whole point of this is not to be, just knee deep in code. But you need to be able to grasp this concept as to why this is so revolutionary. So web components are actually a meta specification. So there's 4 things that if the browser implements these 4 things, it's known to implement web components. The biggest piece of that is probably custom elements. And so let's look at a basic example and unpack from there. So imagine forever your teams or you have been writing code like this. You say, hey, I need to make a hideous looking button. And so hideous button is actually made up of a div with a background color. It points to link.com, and then it says name, and it's got some black text. Well, imagine if instead of having to write that, your teams are able to write their brand new custom element tags, right? So instead of a div or a p, imagine that you can make a my-button, and that the browser just knew how to behave correctly to effectively give you this. And it's a very simple, seemingly simple concept, like, okay, whatever. So this is now unpacked from that. But it allows for this ridiculous level of reuse. And so let's go back in time to the more you know from NBC. This isn't the NBC thing. And look at the guts of what makes up a web component really briefly. So a typical web component has all of the CSS styles inside the component. So imagine a JavaScript file that when you point to it, it teaches the browser about this new tag, this my-button. And then my-button actually sends along the styles to make itself look correct. Then down from, inside of my-button, you might see normal HTML tags like h3 or a div, but you also might see other new custom element tags you've never seen before. So web components allow you to put other HTML and other web components inside of them. And that gives you this kind of by reference, highly semantic way of doing things, right? I can look at this as a developer or even not a developer and say, oh, citation element. I know there's going to be a citation there, as opposed to a whole bunch of random divs and paragraph tags. I know there's a citation. No one knows that. So the other really powerful aspect of web components is that we can define custom properties on our components. So much like there's a href equals whatever, imagine that you can make that my-button and say, oh, my-button has a title, and it has a name, and it has a color, and that if you filled out those 3 things, that you would get the result that you expect, right? So we can make these much more semantic forms of HTML using the standard itself. The last part of the specification has to do with the way that we teach the browser what this is. So there's a brand new type of script tag. It's called script type module. And all that does is it says, hey, go load this script and then load any of the pieces that that script also references, get all of them together, and then deliver the thing. And why that's important is because of that, what you'll typically see at the top of a web component, this is a JavaScript file, is references to other web components and other JavaScript files. So this allows us to modularly reuse each other's code, each other's elements, and stack on top of the work we've previously done in ways that were never before possible. So there's a lot of buzz recently about why web components are good, or why maybe they're not all the way there. And it's because Firefox adopted the full web component specification in October. And that's kind of the sign like, oh, this is a legit part of the standard, right? It's one thing when when Chrome implements something, or Safari, but typically Firefox is seen as like the arbiters of the W3C, actually implementing the specification to pure open source standards. So I would argue that we should be writing articles about why web components are perfect for government, because they're getting a lot of traction in institutions, in higher education, in large corporations, because they have a lot of developers, a lot of applications. They have a lot of targets to hit. Maybe they've done things in Drupal, WordPress, Joomla, and they need to find a way to kind of wrangle all these projects. Well, that's kind of the situation the government is in as well, right? We've got tons of teams across tons of organizations working on tons of websites. And so I think in part, this is why you see people trying to solve the design problems via the USA Gov web standards. So what web components can help solve, though, is you're going to need to solve issues on top of fixing the web standards, right? Even though you have this USA Gov design standard, there's still going to be problems, and here's how. So my interface designer or the USA Gov group, they make this simple button for me to use, right? And I put that button on the interface. I know it's a hamburger menu, and now I can, just implement a bunch of CSS, and I've got the hamburger menu, right? And then my team goes to integrate that designer's button, and they have to do it more than once. Otherwise, why would we make a comp for a singular thing? We probably have multiple buttons. And so when they go about integrating a button or two, it's probably not a big deal. But over enough projects with enough other CSS and JavaScript floating around, this is going to get screwed up. And it's not really anyone's fault. This is kind of just the way the cascading style sheets and JavaScript were meant to work. But we wanted this perfect, beautiful little button to sit there. And now our team is churning and wasting time massaging it to look right in project X. And it's very hard to define why it looks wrong in X versus Y. So how Web Components solves this? So the Shadow DOM part of the Web Component specification is that CSS scoping piece. It's when I mentioned that you can actually ship the CSS with the element. So imagine that that button actually has all the definitions for how to present itself. And at the same time, this thing called Shadow DOM keeps cascading styles from outside from influencing it. It's this perfect little vacuum there. Custom elements help make HTML more semantic. And so as a result of this, and the fact that you can then scope JavaScript to the element itself, you can really make things way more intentional and get your designs to be sustainably implemented. You're not having to slog between, oh, we implemented this thing that's kind of like Bootstrap this year, and then 3 years later, oh, we implemented this thing that's kind of like Zerp Foundation or whatever the new design standard is. So this makes web professionals happy. And so as a part of this, accessibility becomes really manageable, right? So imagine that we know that the only things that can influence the accessibility and the CSS of that button on the interface or tabs or a modal or a drop-down menu, that all could go back semantically to a tag that maybe said drop-down or pop-up-modal. It makes it a lot more traceable for other developers to come along or for people to come around after the fact and go, oh, that's what they meant, right? They can read it semantically, and then maybe you get dinged on accessibility or you're doing testing. You can test each of those pieces independently and know exactly where to go back to, right? What the accountability is. So we've seen maintenance costs just utterly collapse. And there is almost no grind between us having an idea and working on something and it going into production. It's kind of unbelievable because when you work on something in a vacuum, you know that when that ships to production that it's going to function the exact same way in a way that we've never been able to experience before. And so that should really make web managers happy. So looking at this in the context of a real world project problem we had in Drupal. So Elms Learning Network isn't one application, it's a whole bunch of applications talking to each other. And so a whole bunch of applications always have a card, right? There's always a way of presenting an interface element to someone in a reduced form, and then maybe they can search and find, in this case, media. And so we have this media search form, but then we go to another interface and we have this course search form. And what was happening is that fundamentally in Drupal, these were two completely different templates. They were tied to different CSS styles, different JavaScript was involved. And then inevitably there'd be an accessibility issue, or we just wanted to normalize the UX between them. And it unnecessarily became a nightmare. And the reason why is because this is what that TPL file, because this was a Drupal 7 project, looked like. right? So any new person coming along had to then learn the mental model of all of this CSS and HTML structure just to tweak what was there and hope they got it right. And in fact, if you piece through this a bit, you'll see this actually has something called material icons, which is from materialized CSS, as well as things like gray text, darken. And it also has call S12, M6. So this has Zurb Foundation syntax mixed in with materialized CSS syntax. How is a new person supposed to possibly understand this and implement a beautiful, wonderful design style when all this other CSS is floating around? So what it looks like when we converted this single template to web components is this. That entire, nearly 100 lines gets consolidated down to about 6. And so we've now got a column, and I can read it and go, oh, that's where the card is, right? What's the heading? Well, the heading is going to be node title. What's the image? The image is going to be this preview variable. And then there's the view and edit. And so that little block of code actually now dictates this that you see here. Way more semantic, way easier to read and debug, fix accessibility issues with, what have you. And so then it's way more manageable for us, with 11 properties or so, to put that into 11 different EPL files as opposed to that 100 lines of unmanageable gobbledygook. So this helped us escape the Drupal design island. And Drupal really is an island when it comes to design. I love Drupal for the things that it's great at, and design and interfacing with styles is just not one of them. It never has been. And so you can actually start to reuse parts of your Drupal 7 sites in Drupal 8. Should be really appealing to groups that are trying to figure out how do we migrate, what's our plan going forward. Maybe you even have some Drupal 6 sites out there. And so these approaches with web components, you're skipping the backend entirely, and they can be used across CMSs. You can put them into your Twig templates. You can put them into your PHP template files. You can put them in projects that aren't Drupal, right? And remix them across. But let's escape content management systems totally. These are highly compatible across JavaScript libraries as well. So if your team has an Angular project they're working on, or React, or Vue.js, or anything really that's been made in the last 5 years, it's really data level compatible with web components. And so maybe it's a simple win like a card or a button. I highly recommend just starting at a little piece and being able to tunnel your way back out from there. Which is not something you could say of like an Angular or React, where you're kind of re-architecting the whole system. Web Components allows you to kind of stage collapse and move in little bits and pieces towards the total web component future. So who uses this? Maybe you've never heard of it before. Honestly, I hadn't heard of it prior to about 2.5 years ago. So first example here is BYU, Brigham Young University. They use it for branding standardization and accessibility of the top of all of their websites. And when I say all of, I mean, imagine a large university that has tens of thousands of web properties, Drupal, non-Drupal, right? How do you get UX conformity across those? Well, you build things like BYU header, and then you teach other developers, hey, if we implement BYU header, then you're going to get this at the top. So they have a really nice little documentation site that's internally facing for everyone else to build websites off of this approach. So what's common amongst large organizations is you get some buy-in and agreement on these tags. And you don't say, hey, everyone must use these, right? It's kind of the carrots and not sticks. But so you put these tags out on a content delivery network, and then you tell people, hey, if you add this snippet of JavaScript, then you will be able to use these tags. And then it starts to become, it's way easier to use the BYU header than it is to make my own, so I'm just going to use that. And the great thing about this approach, this highly modular approach, is let's say there's a site that doesn't like the search, doesn't like the BYU header. They could learn from the way that that's been constructed and then integrate it, their own way if they had to. Using this very simple approach of a content delivery network with these tags that are highly reusable, BYU has seen 90% of their web properties standardized on this approach. It's just unheard of if you've worked in any of our large institutions, like I also have. So some other company examples, Xfinity and Comcast, they've been using web components for a long time. You can see things like XC header, XC footer. Salesforce just made waves very recently, about 2 months ago or so, by announcing that the new way to interface with their APIs is all via web components. So they have fully bought in on web components. You know, if you want to integrate the Salesforce API into your application, you can use web components to do that. In this case, you can even see their documentation about this is built using web components. Red Hat is also really bought in on web components. Imagine Red Hat, large organization, lots of innovative web properties to talk about their different product offerings. Those are built by different teams in different content management systems or different UI libraries. Patternfly is a way of helping them have a common UI language across these. And you can go to patternfly.org. They have a lot of really impressive open source work there that people can reuse. EA Games is another one, right? So big company, standard way of presenting these cards. I'm going to make an EA game box. YouTube, same thing. Lots of different components in their interface. And as odd as it might seem, you can actually crack open the Settings tab in Chrome browser, right-click, and then you'll be able to start to see web components that are actually in the browser. A lot of different web browser and desktop applications are starting to be built out of web native code, and web native code now equals web components. So people are starting to reuse things that were previously just for the web in desktop applications. So what does this look like in our live context? Well, we have, you know, this is an interface in Elms Learning Network. I've got some buttons at the top there. And what those look like in my template files, my TPL files for Drupal 7, is that I've got like a paper button and an iron icon. And then we've got that JavaScript modular import that we mentioned earlier that's attached to the document. So then when the document ships to you, it goes, oh, what the heck is this? Oh, I've got the definition, and then makes those things behave the way they should. So you might say, okay, that's great, but like, can we in government use this? So I did dig into this a bit. And so these aren't perfect, right? Obviously, this is going to be relative to your site and what the needs are, but just generally with analytics.usa.gov. And this is what the numbers were in April. And now, as of today, we've actually seen them shift even more away from things like Internet Explorer and more towards Firefox and Edge, which is really promising. So over the last 90 days, I would estimate 85.9% of all of that traffic, right? And again, that might be different for your site, will work natively, which means without a polyfill. And what a polyfill is it's just a little snippet of JavaScript that teaches the browser how to interpret web components or other web technologies. The reason that's important is that if something works natively, it's going to be a lot faster. If it requires polyfills, that is going to invoke some performance penalties. You're going to have to do additional testing, things like that. But I was able to figure out that, even just piecing through that data set, 98.5% of all traffic to all government websites should work with web components, with or without polyfill. So looking at that on a global scale, not just government data, I was able to independently verify 98.26% of all traffic to one of my blogs would be able to handle web components. And that it should work, right? I can't test everything, should work with about 99.64%. And these numbers are without talking about progressive enhancement, right? You can come up with strategies of getting those numbers up to 100%. But let's talk about IE and Edge, because I know those are a lot bigger in government and education for that matter. So this is worldwide browser share. I realize it is more in government, but worldwide, from desktop traffic, IE and Edge and other, which is lower than IE 11, do make up a pretty significant portion of traffic. Right? That's like 15% or so. But there was a big announcement last year, or towards the end of last year. Microsoft Edge is switching its under-the-hood rendering engine from something that was called Trident to Chromium, which is the engine that Chrome is built on top of. It's also what Opera runs on. And so as a result of this, the new version of Edge, when it goes full, is going to natively support web components. So with all government traffic, that picks up another like 5% right there that goes from polyfill land to just native. And this came out just the other day, June 19th, from The Verge. Microsoft has released the Chromium version of Edge in development mode, right? It's not fully stable, but it is testing on Windows 7 and Windows 8. So they're shipping this updated Edge browser to older platforms. In fact, for them making good on this screenshot on the right is actually an icon of Edge. So I can run Edge on Mac OS X, which is a little weird. It's like going back in time. They used to be able to get like IE5 on Mac, that I can get Edge again on there. So really, you're going to start to see that use the platform chart from the beginning turn into like, okay, it's Chrome, but Chrome also encompasses Edge. And so really, we're just talking about IE11 and ancient platforms. Well, did you also know that Windows 7 is going to go end of life January 2020? And so I'm not saying everyone will stop running Windows 7, but a lot of these people, a lot of this, in this case, 33% of global browsing traffic is going to have to move off of that, because a lot of people are on Windows 7 by IT policy, or just older machines that, they're going to need to upgrade at some point. Obviously, it's still Windows XP and Vista show up on numbers at some level. But pegging that to some government numbers, right, we've got like 11.8% of all Windows operating systems for government traffic are Windows 7. Those are going to have to be updated to Windows 10 most likely, which then just pushes people ever closer to the refresh cycles associated with those things. And you should see way more people using Edge or Chrome about a year from now than today. And it's not that Microsoft is ending support for IE11, but they did end support for IE10 much earlier than they claimed they would, 3 years earlier, which is a good thing in my opinion. And so, they also wrote this blog post on their developer network like, hey, don't use IE11. So like they're actively telling you don't use one of their products, right? If you want to experience the best of the web, you need to move to off of IE11. The other cool thing, I don't have a screenshot of it or anything yet, is that IE11 in the new Edge browser will just be a tab. And so they're really, even trying to remove it from the interface, remove it as an icon that you can just open, it will still be an application that you can launch, but it'll be much more up to IT policy and administrators to say, like, these websites require IE11 versus today where you have people just generally browsing using IE11, unfortunately. So this stuff will become less and less of an issue really soon. So I mentioned progressive enhancement strategy. I've actually implemented progressive enhancement strategy in another content management system on Drupal that I'm working on, in which I just say, look, if you can't natively handle web components and I can't send you a polyfill, then I'll still send you something, but I'm actually going to treat those platforms like they don't have JavaScript at all. And this has really helped us keep moving forward and pushing out experiences to the vast majority of users while still sending content to older browsers. So what that looks like, if you go to btopro.com, it's my personal blog, and you're on IE11, you're going to see a website that looks like this. And it's, it's not pretty, but it's still giving you the content, right? This is a progressive enhancement strategy. It's making sure you actually still get something instead of just a blank page or a broken JavaScript error. If you come to my site on Edge currently, not the new version, but like today, then you're getting a site like this. It does load web components. It's watered down, but it's still giving you the content and giving you a lot more of the experience than IE11. And then if you're using a modern browser, then you'll get the full site. And by full site, I mean, because all this technology is on the front end, we can have a highly engaging, I scroll through my content, click, it rapidly loads material, auto scrolls, has a whole listing panel of things, right? Everything on this page is a web component, even down to that silly meme where it's shaking his finger. There's a single web component tag on the browser. So wrapping up can I use this? My guess is that a year from now, we're going to see no JavaScript fall back to be about 10% of your traffic, again, generally, and 90% being something that serves web components just natively, which is a huge deal. And that by about 2 years from now, you're looking at like 95.5. So again, don't just say, okay, well, screw those people. But you start talking, what's going to actually be something I can attract development talent to? What's going to make my team's life something non-miserable? And what's also going to still hit those platforms, right? So serving alternate content to those older platforms can allow us to forge ahead with these new JavaScript techniques that are just way more engaging and way more fun to work with than attempting to support these platforms that are going to keep fading away. People are going to keep moving away from these older browsers, these older desktop-based platforms. And so we should be looking ahead to what to serve them next. So when you start a new project or you're thinking about starting one, this is really a technology you should consider in that. I would also recommend starting small, like start with an icon or a button or something that really is kind of trivial, but just to get the workflow down. And be mindful of progressive enhancement, obviously. But look at what other projects you have could be augmented with this approach. There's tons of web components out there, like 2,000 or so on the webcomponents.org site, most of which work in any platform that you can just take and use at will. So I'll say that our team has bought in 110% to this approach. I almost never talk about Drupal at this point. It's always about front-end development. And the reason why is that webcomponents.org and the Web Components Standard is kind of like Drupal modules, but for design, and it's finally a solution on the front end. I avoided all the project churn associated with things like Angular and React, and Vue is not terrible, but there was just so much upheaval in front end for so many years that I stayed out of it. I was terrified of it. And this finally, because it's a W3C standard, this is something that's going to live forever. DOM code that you sent a user 20 years ago as a bunch of paragraph tags and divs still works. And that'll be true of this. So as long as they get the definition of the file, which can be kept with your Drupal project site or whatever, then they're gonna get that experience. They're gonna be able to have their browser register it in a forever kind of a way. So to date, we've produced 384 web components that we use across our different projects. And of those, 331 are general purpose, meaning they don't really have a lot to do with Elms or HAXcms and can be used anywhere, any project. So we have more than Google, so we've kind of bought in. So let's look at some real win web components, if you will. So in the community, there's this thing called Vaden. They contribute a lot of elements. And so if you want a drag and drop uploader that manages multiple files and pipes them to a backend, in Drupal, that's a lot of different modules. In web components, it's a single tag called Vaden upload. If you want to do responsive design, right, which library are we going to use for responsive design? Well, my team doesn't want to mess with that and change it every few years. So we're doing these things called grid plates. And the grid plate tag allows you to define how many columns it has, as you can see in that little code sample, the layout 1-1-1-1, which means a 4-column layout. Then we just place tags in it, and you can use this thing called slots to make them show up in the right place. Highly accessible, works even across design frameworks, other existing like Bootstrap and the other ones. It's tag. This one is a tag that generates a headless form. And so you can actually start to do whole forms on the front end of the browser using this one tag. It's an incredible tag. Maybe you've used VS Code or Microsoft Code, whatever you want to call it. There's a tag we made called code-editor that actually brings the identical experience because it's built on top of their editor, puts it in the front end, and makes it a single tag. Our video player is damn near the most accessible video player that exists on Earth. And so it's been audited by our accessibility office. We have Nikki Massaro-Kaufman, who works on our team. She has been highly focused on this the last year. It is a pretty incredible player. You can see it on webcomponents.org. It's a single tag that you could then take and use. If you need to present a CSV, a table of data entry, instead of typing TRs and TDs and things and wanting to kill yourself, the LRN table tag or CSV-render tag, they're able to actually just take a .csv file on the front end and just turn it into a 100% accessible table automatically. Maybe you want to ask people a question. We've got a multiple choice tag. Maybe you want to render RSS. We've got a RSS items tag. And so the idea is that we just keep taking these different use cases, bundling them up into a web component, and then we don't have to think about that problem space anymore. So whether it's accessible colors, whether it's a button, maybe it's a drawer or a modal, maybe it's rendering math on a page or presenting a license, our QR code, that we can bundle all of that stuff up into a single tag and then ship it to people in a format that will work forever. It's a transformative technology. So real project reuse, right? So this is Elm's Learning Network, right? And forever, I'd say like, hey, come listen to this thing about Elm's Learning Network, and then you wouldn't adopt it because it's like a several million line code base, right? But you might adopt the video player, right? I could get you to adopt a video player. I could get you to maybe adopt those buttons on the edges of the interface. And we started to do this even with our own stuff, right? We were able to take buttons that previously we were wasting our time on and use them across all of our properties. So those buttons on the side there, now when we move fast forward to, this is a different system. This is a studio, online studio experience. It's a social community. Students come in, upload work to each other. We can repurpose all of those design assets across these projects. And so even like the drop-down menu, the cards, the buttons you click on, the icons, everything is repurposable and accountable back to single files. So we get dinged on an accessibility issue in one place, we fix it there, it's fixed everywhere else that had that tag without us thinking about it. So then we get into, in this, again, reuse, there's some comments in that system. So if you want to see kind of the crazy place that we're going with this stuff, you can go to hackstheweb.org and see what this little video is going to present. And so hackstheweb.org, right? So that was just jumping to different points in the video dynamically. That's a single tag. That's an accessible GIF player tag. And so I can click buttons. There's a form that's rendered headlessly. It's a single tag. That form element actually monitors for alt input and make sure that you don't write like the word image, because if you put the word image, it's like, hey, screen readers don't like that. There we go. So you can see it toggling. And so we can start to build these things that help improve the accessibility and UX of all of our web properties. We always view what we're doing as enhancing the web itself as opposed to enhancing Elms or enhancing Drupal or any singular things. And so the reason that that's able to work is, see, like if you inspect source on what the page is, you'll see video-player, or for that code tag, you'll see code-sample. And that becomes things we can stamp over and over and over again. So we've been able to boil these up to a full-on content management system. So this is HAXcms. It's a completely decoupled content management system. It just writes the static files. And the reason we're able to work on this and all of our Drupal projects simultaneously is because all the assets in the user experience live on the front end. And so, I click that button, it's a single tag. I click that button, it's the exact same tag. I want to build something that searches NASA. I can search NASA and present things in cards and then present those things from the cards as maybe a meme because I made a meme at some point in time. Those input fields are also web components. All of these things keep stacking and you can keep repurposing, mixing things into one another seamlessly. And because it's just data sitting in the front end, in what this little thing's showing, I'm gonna take a meme tag and I'm gonna turn it into a license. And so that's taking those data fields and mapping them to new data fields and saying, oh, well, I probably should document this, right? This is something that my staff needs to do legally, but it's really hard to go through a lot of training to even just say, hey, go do that. And there's that four column grid. We've also made tags, in Drupal. This is the Drupal book module, if you will, that allows you to hierarchically organize content. Well, it's a single web component. And because we just keep hammering things that way and telling the backend that, hey, I'm going to send you a blob of data, you should make pages in this case. When I hit save, which is a web component, it's going to send just a simple JSON response to the backend. It's going to create some files, and then I've got this outline. So granted, I don't expect you to, just outright adopt HAXcms, but the whole point is that if we keep working towards these web components, these little incremental pieces, you can get up to these levels rather rapidly. And so what this little video is demonstrating is that, yes, I'm going to make some content or whatever, but this site started out as a blog and changed into this new little educational site. And I'm going to take that and I'm going to change it into something else. And the reason I'm able to do this is that each one of these themes, this whole site design, is a tag. Because the more that you stack these tags up, you'll eventually be able to get into the entire system being delivered to someone, and yet it's still a single tag. So I really think this is the way, the pathway forward, not just off of the Drupal design island, but off of all of the design islands. WordPress is in the same case. Why should we have to make designs specific to Drupal or specific to WordPress? Why can't we just make the best design for the internet and then Drupal or WordPress feed those? So that's kind of where we've been headed with these things. And eventually bubbles up into a full-on flat file CMS in which all those operations are just creating folders and saving the guts of the page into index.html. The reason I show that is that entire editor experience is stuff that's coming to Drupal because it's single tagged. Because we're not tied to Drupal anymore, we can build stuff for anything, basically. So some additional resources, because this is all surface level, to be perfectly honest. You can learn more about web components at webcomponents.org. There's also a cool community site there, so you can search. This is usually, before we start implementing anything, we think of semantically what we're looking for, and we search for it, like an icon or like a button or an upload. And then we see if anyone else has made anything that's pretty good for what that case is. A more open community site, you can go to open-wc.org. It has a lot of getting started, recommendations, guides around the nitty-gritty of actually building web components, setting up tooling, publishing, building for production, things like that. I would also highly recommend checking out patternfly.org for the Red Hat team's Patternfly UI framework. It's very impressive. It could be a good model for, good influence for some government sites as well. If you want to play with stuff without installing tooling, and I usually do this, I'll do this to start out the training as well at GovCon, is if you do lit-element.polymer-project.org, and you click try in that top there, that right there, try, it has a really nice interactive step through as to what all the different parts of building a component are that leverage a product called StackBlitz. So it just runs in your browser and you don't have to install anything. And if you want to get crazy, and this is part of what we'll get crazy with at the training, we actually built tooling that sets up and gets out of the way a lot of the nitty-gritty of how to manage and orchestrate this stuff. So the Elms team has, I mentioned, like 300 of web components. We actually built tooling to build that repo. And so that way we can give that process to other people. To really think the more people that buy in on web components, the more we can share these different pieces of each other's websites, the lower cost it will be to build anything on the web. And so that's elmsln/WC Factory if you want to see what that's all about. But if you want to learn more, if this was interesting to you, then there's on the training site for Drupal GovCon, you can sign up. It's a all-day training. It's called Hacks the Web Components. It's not just about hacks, but it's about kind of all the process and things that led to hacks creation. And so if you want to learn how to make web components and start down this journey, especially I would recommend it if you're in a like, hey, we need to look at retooling for doing, our next project in Drupal 8. If you're gonna go through all the training that's involved with theming in a new version of Drupal, I would just pour that effort into web components, to be perfectly honest, because you'll start to offload the issues involved with just learning another specific template language for a content management system. So with that, I am BTO Pro on all the platforms. I am a coffee addict. And are there any questions? I see there are some questions in the chat here. So, okay, so the first one there from Stan, it says, what kind of performance hit are we talking about when it comes to polyfills? So it really depends on which platform it is. So IE11 has a pretty aggressive penalty with polyfills. That can also start to be dependent on what parts of the web component spec that you really rely on. So in my opinion, to get the most out of this approach, your elements should have shadow DOM, in which there's style encapsulation. The Red Hat Patternfly team, they don't believe that. So actually, I don't know, I'm saying the vast majority, but I actually think all of their elements don't use shadow DOM. I think they use light DOM, meaning it's just sitting in the page. And the reason they do that is they still use Sass to allow for their styles to cascade. So the performance penalty of shipping polyfills to IE11 for their properties will be relatively minimal versus if I was to ship them to like IE11 on HAXcms. which I could do. And by performance penalty, I mean HAXcms is several hundred different web components and their definitions. On IE11, there's going to be a 5 or 6 second hit on getting that to paint initially, and then you get some, like if you click a button and it ripples, as one basic example, that ripple might be incredibly sluggish on IE11. But again, those things start to get into, just how many components you're using, what you're leveraging those components for. And Firefox and Safari, older versions, are the only ones that actually still get that polyfill version. And they don't have nearly the performance hit that IE11 is. Really, when we say polyfills, we should just be talking IE11 because Edge is going to be on Chromium, and that'll more or less eliminate that from the equation. Any other questions? Okay, so this one's from Brock. It says, does shadow DOM mean that there's no way to affect the style of a web component? Like if a button needs to be a certain color on a certain site? Excellent question, Brock. So by default, yes. It would mean that you are saying, hey, this button has, is 200 pixels high by 50 pixels across or something, right? And if you wrote a CSS class that enforces that, you can effectively guarantee that will always look exactly that way. However, the best way to go about piercing the shadow DOM, if you will, is usually the way it's written, is with CSS3 variables. So CSS3 variables will cascade through shadow DOMs. Really what shadow DOM is doing to the browser is, if you've written JavaScript, you write like document.body. Whatever, and that's actually like a root. There's like the whole document, right? Shadow DOM actually creates a new root. So people were faking this with iframes forever to get this level of encapsulation. And so shadow DOM is kind of creating this brand new document root. However, CSS3 variables will cascade through that. So if you said, and what our team has done with color specifically, is we've said, okay, we are going to allow things like accent colors to be modified by the end user. But the only way they're going to modify that is through these very specifically named CSS3 variables. So like if you use one of our tags like multiple choice and you want to change the color of the, when you get it right, it pops up and it says, great job, and it's green. If you want to target that color, there will be a very specific CSS3 variable, which you could read in our documentation for the element. So it starts to become just making sure that these things are built like they're mini APIs and designed with intentionality and have decent defaults, but then allowing people to mix in and override those. There's also a standard that's emerging, and by emerging I mean it'll be everywhere probably in a year or so, called constructible style sheets. If you use lit elements to make your elements, it actually has that baked in. And so I would at least glance at that, like be mindful of that happening. What that'll let you do is basically say like, hey, use this style sheet and actually append it into this shadow DOM so that you can start to have like global design styles correctly cascade through everything. So another question from Stan, have you worked with a way to display these components in a component library like Pattern Lab? Yeah, so let me see if it's working. Actually, I could show you. Might be working. Webcomponents.psu.edu is running Storybook. And so Storybook just lets you present different elements or, for your design guide, right? Like a style guide. And so what we did is we've gone through and actually, this doesn't have all of them, but it has a lot of them, quantified a lot of our elements. So for example, like the icon picker, you can get a demonstration of the icon picker, right? And see the API as to how to use that, provide some examples. Some of them, not all of them, have knobs. Some of them have knobs to manipulate them. But we've used Storybook in order to express our pattern library to other people, right? So you can see pattern library, molecules, atoms. And so there is it's not that it replaces those, but it does have a direct alignment in my mind. Like I've talked to a lot of people that have used Pattern Lab, for example. I would still recommend using something like Pattern Lab if you're comfortable with that, but maybe hollow out the guts of what the templates ultimately are in Pattern Lab and just replace them with, you know, this nice, much more readable API, if you will, as opposed to saying, here, copy this huge blob of divs and H3s. And so you can see, yeah, we have like progress circle, bar charts. This doesn't even actually have all of our elements, but you can see nice, you know, examples of the different elements that we have just through there in our alignment with the pattern library. Any other questions? Oh, what software is needed locally to run the WC Factory or any other tooling? Good question, Brock. So WC Factory is repo off of GitHub, our GitHub repo. It requires Yarn, which then means you need to have Node running locally. And so what it's doing is it's setting in motion what's called a mono repo. And so whenever if you step through what the steps are here, this is actually something we'll go through at the training in Bethesda. What it'll generate for you is this. So like this repo is what our tooling creates. And so that then you can run single commands and pick the library you want to work in to build web components. And then it's basically just putting things in the correct directory in a consistent structure so that teams and people can work on these things and publish them more easily. So you need Node, you need Yarn, and then it has some other dependencies listed there. But the idea is that it's not trying to be too heavy-handed about how you make elements. It's just saying, like, make sure that you structure your elements in a consistent way so that everybody can understand what you're doing and where. So this has really been transformative for our team's processes. We have 4 people on our team, all with different levels of background in web development. But even just like this is a basic thing WC Factory does. It takes an element and breaks it out into these 5 different pieces to work on it, so that our properties are separate from CSS, or separate from HTML, or separate from JavaScript. And so we have a guy on our team, Chuck. He's a more junior developer by far, but he was really able to kind of get off the training wheels of just knowing CSS and HTML by working directly in files related to those. And so even just the basics of, like, I'm in VS Code and it color codes everything nicely is really important to be able to see, like, okay, if I write styles here and then I go back up to this file, that those get kind of compiled together, right? You can start to pick it back apart and go, oh, that's how my CSS relates to this. And you can start to kind of experimentally learn web components in that way. So that's kind of how we've gone about. Any other questions? Brock and Stan, you're killing it here. Cool. So if you have any other questions, is it typically 1 repo per web component? Oh, okay, good question. So what it ends up being is, so we highly recommend mono repos. We used to do 1 repo per element, and it just gets really needlessly complicated as far as the overhead, especially when trying to have multiple people work on it. So just as a basic thing, right? As you make more and more elements, they'll start to reference each other. And so, like you see, here's a commit from Chuck, just updated something. Chuck has a fork of the entire element set, right? Because it's just 1 repo. So then he works on just the thing in question, whether that's, the accent card. But the accent card inside of it might be referencing, like in this case, simple colors or schema behaviors, or any other element that we're making. And so as a result of being in 1 repo, you can have everything managed in a single issue queue. You can know, oh, all right, now I'm going to go over to simple colors and work on just that. So I highly recommend working in mono repos. And then for other people to implement it, off of NPM, because we do publish these NPM, our mono repo will then take every directory in here and publish it independently. So like if you said, npm install @lrn web components /accent-card, you would just get the accent card. But then for us as an organization, we can still work on all these elements in one big place. Dominique, okay, so do you have any suggestions on migrating to web components from React or Angular? So admittedly, I haven't gone beyond like hello world with React. We did make an Angular JS app in a past life, and that actually, we did a talk at DrupalCon Baltimore that was like around how much we hated doing an Angular JS app and that we moved to web components. So if you have something in production, let's start here. Do you mean that you have something in production that you're migrating, or that you just as a developer are coming from that worldview? Typing, hopefully typing. Well, so if it's a, okay, our software platform is based on React. Okay, so if you already have something that's out in production that's on React in this case, I would look for small wins. This is what we did with Elm's Learning Network when we first started experimenting with web components, because honestly, when I first started reading the spec, I was like, there's no way this is legitimate. This is just some Google thing. Because I had read a bunch of hype articles that seemed to indicate that. However, once I got over that, what I did was I just made something standalone. I was like, oh, neat. And then I was like, okay, I got to make this real. So I just took, I believe it was an iron icon. And so a lot of times what we end up doing is we go to like webcomponents.org and I search for like iron icons. And I know these names now, but like originally I searched for just icon. And then what I do is I would look through the documentation or see a demo of this and go, oh, it would be really nice to just write iron icon equals accessible and get the little accessibility icon. So I just picked a single icon. It was just like our menu icon with like 9 dots in a grid. And I just went through the motions of how do we get that into our workflow? What does the process look like to get this single web component into the page? Once we got comfortable with that process and we proved like, okay, this will actually work, then we started to hollow things back out. So we started to say like, oh, that's a button. Okay, let's turn that into a web component. Oh, over there is a card. Let's turn that into a web component. And so I would say the best way to migrate isn't to actually full on migrate your application. It's to, kind of stage collapse. This is kind of the approach that we've been taking with Drupal as well, where we're more or less stage collapsing our way towards headless. We're not just doing a full-on rewrite because, your team has a multi-million-dollar budget in order to just go headless tomorrow, like the whole Drupal community seems to be pushing, which just isn't practical at all, especially for small teams. So I would recommend starting little pieces, slowly work your way there, put it into a few properties, get down the workflows, see what it looks like. Especially with React, you're going to have to be either using a rollup or a Webpack, but bundler most likely. See what it looks like when it filters into those. Play with a couple different web component libraries. I would highly recommend Lit Element. You can just use vanilla, but I would recommend Lit Element as a good place to get started. And then just work your way out from there. Kind of tunnel out of what we've all had as these monoliths and mini monoliths into something that's modular and can be repurposed across all of our properties.
Okay, well, it doesn't look like I see any more questions coming in, and we are actually slightly over our 1 hour time slot. So thank you, Brian. I wanted to make a mention, folks. If this is something you want to learn more about, Brian is hosting a full day of training from 9 to 4 on the Tuesday before Drupal GovCon during our training day. I did post a link directly in the Eventbrite or to the Eventbrite. You will need a ticket for Drupal GovCon, even if you're only coming to the training. So if you haven't already registered for Drupal GovCon, make sure you do that, but then grab a spot through the Eventbrite for the actual training course. So thanks everybody for your time. We did record this session, and if you registered with us through Eventbrite, we're going to be sending out an email that has a link to the recording, as well as just a short survey to get your impressions of the webinar and how it went, and ideally for anything else you might need. So I see that Brian's willing to stick around for a little bit longer. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then you guys can just go right ahead. I'll go ahead and leave it open. Thanks for your time, everybody.